Is it the right height for you? Yes.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to everybody here in St Peter Mancroft Church in Norwich. On behalf of the Vicar and the PCC, my name is Chris Sallam. I'm the head of the events and also head verger here at the church. And a special warm welcome to those who are joining us via the church YouTube channel. If you want to listen to this talk again and perhaps remember even more what Dr. Adrian is going to tell us this morning, I encourage you to have a look online again and also look at the archive one from last year. This morning, Dr. Adrian is going to be giving us a talk entitled Of Tokens and Traders, Tales of Small Change, I thought, from the 17th century. Those in church might want to have a look afterwards at the exhibition which Adrian has put together, and also he's got some books on sale at the back of the church, as well as also our brand new hot off the press church guide. So on your behalf, may I welcome Dr. Adrian Marsden, who's going to speak to us of tokens and traders. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. It gives me also a great deal of pleasure to be back here. 2 years ago to the very day, my wife Natasha and I were married here. So this is actually our second wedding anniversary, so it seemed apt. The wife didn't complain too much. Anyway, a year ago, last year, I gave the first part of this talk, which was about the token issues of St Peter Mancroft Parish itself. Can you all hear me okay, by the way? I'll take that as a yes. So, don't worry, if you missed that talk, you are thrice blessed, because you can see it on YouTube. You can buy the booklet at the back. Half the money goes to the church. And thirdly, there's a little exhibition, a brief summary of it at the head of the north aisle here. So don't worry, and you can see it again. This is this year though, and today we're going to travel beyond St Peter Mancroft and look at some of the other token issuers in Norwich. Very firstly, I will give you a brief talk about the tokens themselves. I won't go into great depth. You can see that on last year's talk, and we have slightly less time this year. This is the economic background. Basically, to cut a long story short, there's a massive shortage of small change in 16th and 17th century England and Britain in general. You can see the coins, a halfpenny, 2 pennies, and a 2 penny. You can see these are small discs of silver. They're easy to lose, they're very fiddly and difficult to actually make because they're so small, and so there's not enough of them being made. So there's a shortage of small change. This is difficult for us to understand today. Online payments, you can pay with your phone, whatever. In the 17th century, it's a very real problem. If there's not enough small value currency to go round, you've got problems. So what do people do? Well, when Charles was first had his head cut off in 1649, there's no actual king, so people start having their own money made. Now, these are tokens. They're different to coins, which are worth their weight in metal. All these you see are good silver. Tokens are purporting to be worth that amount of money. There's not a farthing's worth of copper in a farthing token, but because there's nothing better, people are forced to accept them. This is what they look like. Small discs, you can see how big they are, 15, 16 millimetres in diameter. That's about 2/3 of an inch in old money. And all the ones in Norwich are worth a farthing. Now, a farthing in 1650, 1660, 1670, which is the date these tokens circulate, you're looking at 1649 to 1672 when they're banned. They're worth a farthing, which is about £1 in old money. It's difficult to correlate old money, which is pre-decimal, and what something's worth today. But if you go on what people are paid, and what things cost and try and work out indexes that way. A pound then is worth about £1,000 today. And so a farthing, which is a quarter of a penny, and you get 240 pennies to a pound, is working out roughly at a pound coin. They have no smaller currency than that. You don't have 1p, 2p, 5p, anything like that. But a farthing is good for buying, say, half a loaf of bread, whatever. Okay, let's look in detail at 4 typical farthings, and this will give you an idea of what these things are like and the images they carry. They'll carry the name, in this case, Peter Deal. Note that Peter's misspelled with 2 E's, and in the Norwich records, he's normally referred to as Dale. These tokens are made in London, so you often get mistakes between someone hearing the name or mishearing it and then making mistakes when making the token. So Peter Deal, his name, and then in Norwich, 1664 date, as I say, these dates vary, 1650s, 1660s. And then a helmet. We know that Peter Deal is an armourer by trade, so he makes armour. So a helmet, very, very useful sort of for a signboard. Signboards would have hung above someone's business and they would have an image appropriate. So people know that at the sign of the helmet, Peter Deal is knocking out his armourer's trade. And then also very significantly, you have a triad of initials here on the reverse, on the tail side. PD, Peter Deal, and the A is for his wife. We know that his wife was called Amy. This can be useful when you're researching. That one initial of a wife can be good. In fact, we'll come to one case of that later. George Reeve, he's a grocer, and this shield here shows the arms of the Worshipful Company of Grocers of London. That's used nationwide by anyone in the grocery business. These people aren't dealing in spuds and tomatoes. These are sort of wholesalers and retailers. It's a different meaning to a word to the one that we have. And then in Norwich, and GR, and then R, George Reeve, and we know his wife was called Ruth. Richard Morant, this odd symbol, which may be a sun coming over the horizon, may not. And then in Norwich, RM. We know that Richard Morant was married, indeed he's a plague victim together with his wife, but he doesn't put her initial on. Not all people do. So because you've not got that third initial, doesn't necessarily mean that the issuer wasn't married. And finally, Violet Benton. Benton was a very wealthy linen draper. Sign of the key, again, that's a signboard over his business. And then in 1664 again, VBR, and he was married to a Rebecca. So they're 4 typical examples of what these tokens look like. We won't go on about the actual tokens themselves anymore. We'll instead look briefly at the city of Norwich in the period, and then we'll move on our virtual tour, basically, of issues from outside Mancroft. Right, Norwich in 1661. This is a woodcut showing Norwich in 1661. In actual fact, it appears to be a rip-off of a similar woodcut showing Norwich at the end of the Elizabethan period, about 60 years earlier. But it does nonetheless show pretty much what Norwich was like. You've got the medieval city walls. You've got nothing in the way of housing, really, beyond those. You've got lots of gardens and orchards. It's quite an airy, leafy sort of place. You have got industry as well, and you've got the familiar landmarks of the castle, the cathedral, and also the marketplace down there. So that's Norwich in 1661. The population, about 20,000, give or take, which makes it the second city in the country. And indeed, that's the case with the token issuers, because we know that 91 men and women issue tokens in Norwich. 20 odd of those are in Mancroft, the others are outside So a fairly sizable place, and we can be sure that there's lots of token use going on. Lots of tokens, for example, are found now at Posick, just outside Norwich. That's not because people are using them so much in Posick, but that's where the night soil went from Norwich. So they're sweeping up all the rubbish and taking it out for dumping and manuring at Posick, and lots of tokens get mixed up with that. Okay, if we swing round our aerial view of Norwich in 1661, put it on its side, and then compare it to a map. This was from the west, this viewpoint, and here we have a map with north at the centre. So, Mancroft here, number 35, this big circle, and you can see the rest of the city. You've got the Wensum coming through it, and you've got two parts. You've got the south part here, and then this north part here called Ultra Aquam, over the water, which is also becoming quite big in this period. So that's what we're looking at. And for our virtual tour, we are going to start here, right at the bottom by the south gate, also called the Conisford Gate, and then wander up, skirting Mancroft, going over the river into the northern part, and we will end right at the top left, number 27, at the top of that block, top of that parish, which is the parish of St Martin's Oak, and we will end at St Martin's Gate. So we'll have a full sort of conspectus of token issuers in the area outside, or rather a selection of them. The two maps I'll use to accompany this tour are Hoyle's map of 1728. This is the Mancroft area in 1728. It has this huge market cross, number 14. That is pulled down in 1732. And then you can see it doesn't appear on King's map of 1766, which is the second map I'll be using. So these two maps between them, King's map names places, Hoyle's map names them but with a key and not so easy to see. So I'll be using both of these maps in the course of this virtual tour. Right, the sources we'll be using. There are many of these. There's parish records. One second. Sorry about that, I just could do with a glass of water. There's parish records, so baptisms, marriages and burials. These are kept in the form of parish registers, so they're written down, and then the registers themselves have been either transcribed or they're available on microfilm, or even online on various genealogy websites. So they're useful. Of course, with them you can trace a token issuer's baptism, marriage and children and burial. There's the mayoralty court books. These are big hefty tomes in the Norfolk Record Office, and these set down all the rulings and judgments made by the Mayor's Court, which sits and meets at the Guildhall across the market. And occasionally you get token issuers popping up in there if they've either done something wrong or they want something done or whatever. There's also the half-tax assessments. Now, the main tax in this period is a tax on halves. So, depending how big your building is, it will have either 1, 2 or more halves. Some of these houses have lots of halves, so 8 or 10. Big country piles have sort of 20, 30 odd. And smaller dwellings just have 1. But the interesting thing here is you can work out, if they're listed, in which parish someone is assessed for half tax, so in other words where they live. And then there's wills and other probate records. These can be incredibly useful because they detail what people are leaving behind and who they're leaving it to. We don't have wills for everybody, but we have wills for a few. They can be, and of course you can use those to check against the wife's initial, assuming that they're still married to the same wife when they die as to when they issue the token. Thanks, Chris. And then we have many other contemporary records, various other things that are held in the record office and so forth. So, right, let's start. We will start with Matthew Salter. Matthew Salter in Norwich, oatmeal maker, and then MS and B. His wife is Bridget. We will come on to her later. Now, Matthew Salter is an oatmeal maker. Now, oatmeal is it's basically what you make porridge out of. You can also add it to stews and things like that. It's a staple in the 17th century. It's quite cheap and useful for the poor as well as the wealthier. So it's a pretty vital ingredient. And obviously this oatmeal isn't grown in Norwich, but it's shipped in. This is where we are. As I said, we start at the South Gate. We're just inside the South Gate now, and this is St Etheldreda, and this is the parish where Matthew Salter lives. And as you can see by the map and also by the photograph, this is an aerial photograph from the 1930s. You can see the river coming through, and this is on King Street. And in the 17th century, and indeed up until relatively recently, this is an area where there's lots of shipping coming in, and this is where the docks were. So things are coming in to be offloaded, and one of the things that's being offloaded for processing in Norwich is oatmeal. So Salter is nearby the shipping, so the oatmeal doesn't have too far to travel when it's being unloaded. Now, if you've got a lot of oatmeal in a place, it might cause trouble. And indeed, we have this record in the Mayoralty Court books here, that it is ordered that the oatmeal house of Matthew Salter in St Etheldred's parish shall be shut up by the overseers of the said parish and the constable to assist them. Now, the date of this is interesting, 19th of May, 1666. That is just when the plague is hitting Norwich. Hits London the year before, 1665, and then runs riot in Norwich the following year. Now, we know from the very fragmentary records of St Etheldred's parish that several of Matthew Salter's children die in that period. Almost certainly plague. It makes you wonder if the plague came by ship, and it's then offloaded with the oatmeal. And you wonder if it's not plague related, why the oatmeal house is being shut down. Is it because of him, our little fellow? Is the place overrun with rats and things like that? It's possible. It certainly seems more than a coincidence that the oatmeal house is being shut up just at this time when the plague, we know, is starting. We also know that there was a correlation made at the time between animals and the spread of plague. This is from the Norwich Mayoralty Court books. This is a bit later. This is in 17th of July 1666, when plague prevention measures are taking place. And it is ordered that Samuel Vial of St Michael at Coslany be from henceforth employed to kill dogs, cats and swine that shall be found in any of the streets of this city, and he shall have 3d for every dog and swine he shall kill. And it then goes on. But just to illustrate that there is a connection made, might not be a correct connection, but it's what people are thinking, and that's what's important. We'll go back to Bridget now. We saw her initial on the token. Now, she dies in 1670, aged 42, after having given birth to 22 children. Sadly, we don't have the surviving records in full. They're very patchy for St Etheldred's parish, but we do have this on a tombstone, which was there and recorded. So we do know she did have 22 children. And then there's a little poem on the memorial. Though dead yet dear, though dear yet dead to me, dead is her body, dear is her memory. Now, you might have thought But after 22, albeit some of them die in a plague, Matthew might have had enough. But no, he takes a second wife, Margaret. This time he only has 10. So we have this bit in the records. John Salter, the son of Matthew Salter, and Margaret, his wife, was baptised November the 12th, and then, very nicely, it says, being the 31 child. So, being Matthew Salter's 31st. He only has one more after this. But there's certainly nothing wrong with Salter's oats. Anyway, that's Salter for you. We'll move up the hill a bit, or along King Street, to Thomas Hans here. His actual name is Hawes. This Hans is another error on the part of a token maker. But an anchor, Norwich 1664, and he's married to an Elizabeth, and we know from the records that Hawes was a keel man. Now, this is again connected with the river. Keel men are the people who unload the stuff. And there's a company of them, and I suspect that Hans, or Hawes, he's a young man, but I suspect he's not a mere keel man. I suspect he's got a gang of keel men working for him. He doesn't have a very good time with it, though. He's about 27 when we get that plague hitting. This is St. Julian's, you can see just up the road number 11, so we're just moving steadily north. And Julian's, like a number of other churches in Norwich, was hit in the Second World War, and so what you see now is very much a reconstruction and rebuilding. Here we've got a typical shot of the church after the bomb. Hawes is rather unlucky, though, as I said. Again, it's about year 1666, and he doesn't make a proper will, he makes a nuncupative will. That's where you give your will on your deathbed by word of mouth, and you have witnesses to record it. And that's what happens with Hawes, and you get this rather touching scene, which word so uttered and spake, he that said Thomas Hawes had his wife in his arms. This is May 1666, same area as the Oatmeal House being shut down and everything. So I wonder, is this an early plague death, which might not have been recognised as one, because if they did recognise he'd got the plague, you probably wouldn't have witnesses to affirm that the nuncupative will was correct. Right, we'll move up north and sort of swing west now, and we'll get to Henry Sidner's place. Sidner issued 2 tokens. He issued this one with a greyhound on it, which is key, because this tells us where he was. Dated 1659 in Norwich, and we know he's married to Jane. We have an I here. They didn't have J's in this period, so an I is used for a J. And he also issues a second token 8 years later in 1667. Same bloke, Henry Sidner, but this is quite nice because he's not using the greyhound again, but he's using the tallow chandler's arms. So this tells us what he did. He is a tallow chandler, he's a maker of candles. Tallow candles are what you generally use in that period. They're a bit nasty, they're sort of dipped in animal fat, they're smoky, they're not so good as wax candles, but they are a lot cheaper and people can afford them. Bear in mind, there's no artificial lighting apart from candles in this period, so it's tallow candles or nothing. Still married to Jane, as you see. Now, it's that greyhound, which is useful, and we have here on King's map of 1766 the Greyhound Inn. Now, you can see where we are. This is where St. Stephen's meets, so what's now Surrey Street. And we have the Greyhound in the 1930s. It's not called the Greyhound anymore. It's now changed its name to the Old Boar's Head. It changed its name in the 1840s, but it's the Greyhound until then. And you can see typical late medieval half timber building, gables and then big chimney stacks, and you've got a policeman. But this is where it stood. It gets bombed in the Second World War, like other places. We've also got a photograph here of it having been bombed. But the key here is this building next door. And this is the place today. You've got the same building here, the bank next door, the Greyhound completely gone, and if you've seen the picture of the Greyhound just now, you can see it goes out a lot further. And you can see from that first photograph, if you look, that the St Stephen's Ven is a lot narrower. It's been broadened out considerably, and that's helped in part by the destruction of the poor Greyhound. But that's the Greyhound for you. So we've got Henry Sidner, a tallow chandler, operating out of a Greyhound. It doesn't necessarily mean he owned the place, but he's working there. Inns in this period are big places. They'll have courtyards at the back, and so you've got lots of businesses operating out of them. They're not just places where you go for a drink. And interestingly, we have a Leadser slab for Sidner. We don't have many Leadser slabs for token issuers at all. Last year, I mentioned the Leadser slab of Susan Brown at the back. We have some Brockdens in the north aisle, and then we have the war memorial for Augustine Briggs by the organ. That's all we've got surviving. There's probably quite a few beneath the pews and others worn smooth. But even in a great church like St Peter Mancroft, that's all we've got left. And we know that there are 20-odd people buried here. So we don't see many. This isn't actually in Norwich. This is in Brumstead, near Stalham. So Sidner, indeed, we've got his will, and he specifies burial there. It doesn't seem he came from there, but maybe he had connections we're not aware of. But that's where he's buried. Henry Sidner, gent, who died the 18th of April 1678, aged 79. Interestingly, he calls himself gent. Now, if you've done well in trade, as Sidner undoubtedly has, he's worked hard at the grubby business of tallow chandling, he's got the money to buy the land, which means he can call himself a gent. He's now a gentleman. Okay, we'll wander around the marketplace now and go up Dove Lane. This is Richard Freeman. He's got the sign of the Dove. We know the Dove was an inn on Dove Lane. This is the little alleyway leading from the marketplace to St John Madder Market. It had the Dove on it. The Dove no longer survives. You've got Tesco's on the corner. And then you can see here, central about 2/3 of the way up. Dove Lane. And here we have it today. You can see going towards St John Madder Market. And then you've got, named after the Dove Tavern, which no longer exists. We know that the Dove had 8 halves, because it's where Freeman is in the half tax. The interesting point about Freeman is not so much his career as an innkeeper, because we know he is a vintner, he's a seller of wine, at the Dove, but rather a connection we can make. This is the painting called the Paston Treasure, which hangs in Norwich Castle Museum down the road. And it shows the collection of objets d'art formed by the Pastons in the mid-17th century. You've got various cups made out of a nautilus shell. You've got all these rather fabulous, rare things from far, far away. And the painting commemorates that. Now, Oxnead, where the Pastons lived, this great stately home, no longer exists, and indeed it didn't exist when this drawing was made, but this is a Victorian reconstruction of Oxnead. It's a massive pile. The Pastons lived well. And rather nicely, we have another Paston treasure, not in the form of the painting, but in the form of the accounts for Oxnead from a period 1653 to 1655. So a little window, and they record all the incomings and outgoings of the estate. So not only what the Pastons had bought in for consumption, but also things the Pastons sold from their own estate, like timber and so on. And Freeman, rather nicely, figures 3 times in those accounts for selling sums of wine to the Pastons. We know, depending on the quality of the wine, it works out either 6pence a pint. So not cheap, because 6pence is about 30 quid in today's money. So wine, not cheap, but of course it's being imported, and transport costs a lot more then relative to now. But it's quite nice that one of our token issuers can be connected to Oxnead in this way. Francis Elmer at the sign of the 3 Foxes. Now, I mentioned earlier about how, with luck, you can use that 3rd initial to tie someone in, because it gives you the name of their wife, and if you've got people in the records with the same name, that can be helpful. And that's just the case with Francis Elmer. There are 3 men of that name. 2 are worsted weavers, 1 is a wool comber or a wool merchant. Now, all 3 of those men could have issued a token. We have worsted weavers issuing tokens, and we have wool dealers issuing tokens. But it's about G. The family basically come from St Gregory's, but we have a record of 1, the wool comber, marrying Grace Borman. She's of St George Tombland, and he's of St Gregory's. So he moves to St George Tombland, where indeed he's buried, and we'll come to that in a minute. Grace predeceases him. He then takes another wife. This is actually wife number 3, because by wife number 1, Mary, who he marries in 1653, he had a son. She seems to have died out of complications arising from childbirth a couple of weeks later. He then marries Grace, and then he marries his 3rd wife, Margaret, later on. But G, so we know from that G that this is the Elmer who marries Grace. And indeed, this is where we are. We've now moved round to the north, and St George's Tombland, as the name tells you, is just off Tombland. Tombland is still an important place in 17th century Norwich. It's where the market was before the Normans came, so it still retains that sort of trading character. So it's another sort of hot spot for trade. This is a picture of the place, rather nicely set off the actual area of Tombland. And if you go in, the front door, just on your left, took me some time to find it, although it's staring me in the face. It's his monument. This is quite an elaborate one, black marble. It has a coat of arms. These are probably Aylmer's arms, which he's probably got when he becomes a gentleman, halved with those of his wife. You've got these little marklets, and then you've got Fretty, this crosswork. And then at the foot of this pillar lies interred the body of Francis Aylmer, Gent, who's another of these who's, as we've seen, done well out of trade. Departed this life the 10th of October 1686, and then also his son Philip, who died quite a few years later in 1727. So, again, rather nice. We've got a tombstone. Okay, Henry Holby. Now, Holby's quite an interesting case. He was the apprentice of Robert Douglas, who was a cutler, a maker of blades, and also a haberdasher. And Henry Holby follows the same trade. 1659, and his emblem is a hand grasping a sword or a blade. So, again, it makes clear his profession as cutler, as a maker of blades. And it also gives where he lives, and it's quite specific. Goes near Redwell in Norwich. He's married to another G again, it's a Grace. Now, Redwell is quite interesting. We know where it is from the map. It's labelled on King's map of 1766, here. Now the street names have changed, which doesn't help. Redwell Street originally ran down towards Tombland. Now it's changed, and that's called Queen Street, and Redwell Street has moved to what was then Musborough Street, running from the Redwell down to Elm Hill. So that's where we are. We've got Queen Street, and it tells you when you go there, known as Redwell Street in the 18th century, name changed by the early 19th. Now, Redwell, we know it was a well with a red top. It's got a big sort of covering or roof in red, and so it's Redwell. And it was an important city landmark. It was demolished in the 19th century, so there's no survival of it. This is roughly where we are from an aerial photograph of a view on the ground. The record, the signpost, seems to think it's here, where I've circled, and this area where you've got this little machine on the photo. The map seems to place it a bit west of there, but anyway, it's in that area. We don't know much about Holby, but we do have an interesting record dating to 1648, when he's either just finished his apprenticeship with Douglas or he's still in the late stages of it. And that relates to the event known as the Great Blow. The assembly house up there has great store of gunpowder, nearly 100 barrels, and there's a little warriors uprising, to cut a long story short, and in the chaos that follows, the gunpowder catches light, the place goes up in smoke, and indeed the explosion is so devastating it kills quite a few people, and it blows out all the glass out of here and out of the Guildhall on the other side of the market. So it's a major event, and there are lots of inquisitions after that, because Parliament are not happy about it, so people are sent to take statements. And one of those statements concerns Henry Holby, and it suggests he's not very keen on his job as a watchman, because Holby is there on watch the day this happens, and it's recorded that after a while he hands over his pike, together with one of his friends, to a group of his mates, and they go down the pub. So that's what Holby was doing when the Great Blow happened. And Redwell now, although there's no Redwell left, the name has been seized upon, not least by the Redwell Brewery. Right, we'll move just a little way down what was Redwell Street and is now Queen Street, to see James Castile, or James Castle. He issues 2 tokens. This, the first one, is 1662. The second one is 1664. His name's spelled differently. It's Castle and then Castile. Woolcombe, he's in the wool trade, and his wife, I. Now, we know I was Jane, and we know that Jane was his second wife, and indeed she's getting on when she marries James Castile. The common connection is they are both French. Jane's first husband is Jean Lempereur, who is a wealthy wool merchant. Her second husband, James, is christened Jacques Castile. He's probably a bloke baptised in 1605. So they're married in 1659, so they're both getting on. And we know that Jane Lempereur has lots and lots of kids by her first husband. They're not having any children when they're married, so it's a second marriage late in life for both of them. And we have Jane Castile's will, and interestingly, she leaves £10 to the poor of the French congregation. Now, this is the French church. Where was it? As I said, it's just down the road. Here we have it. It originates as the parish church of St Mary the Less, but then shortly before the period we're talking about, it's taken over by the French immigrants, the French congregation, who wants to to worship according to their own practice. Here we have it. Walloons, if you like. Someone particularly pedantic has pointed that out on the sign. But it is l'Église Walloon, or the Church of the French Congregation. And from 1637 to 1832, that's where they worship. Now, the £10 gift of Jane L'Empereur, very generous. It's about £10,000 in today's money. Mostly when tokenisters give money to the poor of a parish church, which they quite often do, is £1 or £2. So she's showing some generosity. And interestingly, no mention of James. We know that he's predeceased her. There's one James Castile mentioned. He didn't get any money, but he's mentioned in her will. I suspect that's James's son by his first wife, who we don't know anything about. But she chooses to be buried beside her first husband, the long-dead Jean L'Empereur, and not by her second husband. Some people do that. Some people, like Jeremy Vinn, leave the first two to lie alone and are buried with her third wife. Not so in this case. And so we often get this pattern where the second husband doesn't be buried with his second wife, or vice versa. This is one last look. You can't see this church now because it's completely built up. Buildings all around it. But this was taken in the 50s when, for a brief period, they were doing some rebuilding around it. So you can actually see the fabric of the church. These days, as I say, it's completely built up around. James Barton here, not a particularly great token, but you can see the details. And you have here two figures flanking a tree, and the initials IBE, James Barton, E for Elizabeth, his wife, and the date 1667. The figures are quite clearly the Adam and Eve, and that places Barton. The Adam and Eve is one of only two pubs which survive from the period we're talking about until today, the other one being the Lamb around the corner. It's right up here in the parish of St Martin's at Palace. Now, we have Barton attested there for about 3 years, from about 1666 to 1669. We know that before that, he's at St Lawrence, and after that, he moves back to St Lawrence. So his tenure at the Adam and Eve is quite short. He presumably sets up trade there. He seems to be a worsted weaver. He's operating there, possibly running the licence as well. And then for some reason, things aren't working out, so he moves back to St Lawrence. But we do know that in 1667, perfectly for a token, that's where he was, at the Adam and Eve in the parish of St Martin at Palace. This is a place today, you're probably familiar with it. Typical sort of building of the period. And the little signboard, still the Adam and Eve. Right, John Leverington now. Leverington was married to his first wife when this token was struck with the initial V. Well, just as there were no J's in the 17th century, there were no U's. So there were U's, but they were spelt as V's in capitals. So the V is a U, and the wife's name is Urith, which is quite sort of biblical. Now, Urith Leverington dies in the early 1660s and is buried at St Simon and St Jude with her 3 small children, her 3 babes. Now, I've kept trying to get to see her Ledger slab, which is in the chancel, apparently, but the chancel keeps being used for storage and various things, and I still can't get in to see it. But fortunately, we do have a transcription of the Ledger slab by Bloomfield, the Norwich historian, the Norfolk and Norwich historian, who's writing in the mid-18th century. This is where we are. Again, we're moving towards the river here, and we will be in ultra aquam across the water very soon. This is the church. It lies at the bottom of Elm Hill as you're walking towards the bridge. And this is that poem on her ledger slab. It gives her name and age, and then lower down at the bottom it has this rather touching inscription. The night is come for sleep, lo here I stay, my three sweet babes sleep here, we wait for day, that we may rise and up to bliss ascend, where crowns and thrones and robes shall us attend. Thy worst is past, O death, thou'st done thy part, thou couldst but kill, we fear no second dart. Resurgamus, we will arise. Now, Urith was Leverington's first wife. He marries again. He chooses to be buried next to Urith, his first wife, and indeed his second wife chooses to be buried next to her first husband. But the interesting thing is we have a reference in John Leverington's will to a property. Now, references like this are gold dust because they show you generally where someone lived, and sometimes that property survives today. One such case is the Black Boys. He leaves two inns. He leaves the Black Dog in Catton and the Black Boys, which is on Colgate. This is where it is, so not far from St Simon and St Jude. It seems he moves into Colgate Parish when he marries his second wife, and he bequeaths the Black Boys to that second wife. And this is the Black Boys in the 1930s on one of the Plunkett photographs. We even have the sign is still the same, the name is still the same, and it has this distinctive facade. This is obviously a later facade, not the one at the time, but it is still in operation, not as a pub, but as a curry house. So, yet another place you can actually visit in the flesh that was there at the time. It has undergone some remodelling, as you can see. The roof has been changed since even the photograph was taken, and obviously the facade and much of the interior are very different, but the actual building itself is still there. Right, we'll move towards a close now and look at two more parishes as we continue through Ultra Aquam. The first one is St Mary's. This is here, off what's now Oak Street, running towards what was the gate to St Martin's. This is the church. This is the one good thing about lockdown. You could walk around Norwich and take nice photographs of places. And people were cluttering at the landscape and we had lovely weather. This is St Mary's, but it's not St Mary's I want to talk about. It's the building directly opposite on St Mary's Plain, and that is St Mary's Baptist Chapel. Now, the Baptists are a minority religious group in the 17th century. They aren't terribly unpopular. We looked at the Quakers last year and how they were persecuted, but the Quakers do things differently. They meet separately, they have their own burial ground and all that sort of thing. The Baptists are a bit more mainstream. Their one belief is that children shouldn't be baptised as infants, they should be baptised later in life when they've made up their minds, basically. You do get quite a few of them, though, and this is where they hang out in St Mary's Baptist Chapel. And we have two of them who are quite interesting. First one, the tokenist of Thomas Lesingham, or Lessingham. This is struck when he's married to his first wife with the initial D. I can't find out anything about her, but we do know that later on, in the 1660s, he marries Frances Jolly at Dagenham, and he is described as a mercer of Norwich, a widower, the first wife being D, and he's 36, she's 24, a spinster. So that second marriage happens, and we know that they both, if he's not already there, they both move into the Baptist community. And when Lesingham dies, Frances, his widow, marries this bloke, Thomas Flatman. Now, Flatman is another tallow chandler, and he marries Frances, the widow of Thomas Lessingham, and we've got them attested in the Baptist community. The interesting thing about Flatman's tokens, however, is we have no fewer than 3 of them. We have this one. This is not 1664. This is post-1666, because he didn't move to Norwich until 1666. Because before, he wasn't in Norwich. He was in Pulham St Mary. Note 1664. This is the same die. This is the same stamp as used on his Norwich tokens. So he's simply reusing the die and not changing the date. But that's where he was in 1664. And also of Pulham Market. On this occasion, they've changed from Pulham St Mary to Pulham Market. It's possible they got the first order wrong, and Flatman was so annoyed that he insisted they do another batch. But interestingly, you've got 3 different locations on his tokens. The first 2 where he is in 1664 in Pulham, and then we know he moves to Norwich in 1666 and buys for freedom of the city, and then he sets up in Norwich, and then of course, as we've seen, he ends up marrying Frances. We're finally at pretty much our final stop now, and this is St Martin at Oak. Now, Isaac Percival, who's a worsted weaver, married to Jane, issues a token in 1667, and it shows an oak tree. Now, this oak tree has a very interesting history. The oak tree there in 1667 is probably about this big, because we know it's a very young oak tree, and I will come back to that. Because the original oak tree, which was there in the Middle Ages up until 1550, was a very old oak tree indeed, and it had an image of the Virgin Mary in it, an icon if you like, and it's a place of worship and almost in Norwich, almost local pilgrimage. This is an important tree, and it gives the parish its name, St Martin at Oak. But it's so Catholic, if you like, so papist, this idea of an image of the Virgin Mary in it, that Edward VI sends people to chop it down. So the first oak tree gets the chop, quite literally, and the image, of course, is destroyed. Now, we've got Isaac referencing the oak tree, though. Now, this is where we are. So, again, on Oak Street, the name still surviving, going up towards St Martin's Gate. Okay, we'll look at John Taybor next. Now, Taybor is a gardener. He uses this image of a spade on his tokens. 1663 in Norwich, T-I-M. Now, Taybor has a very interesting history because he's church warden. He's also constable in St Martin at Oak for a while. But there's an interesting record in the parish registers which doesn't seem to survive any longer, but it's recorded by Bloomfield, and it goes with, I, John Taybor, constable and overseer, went to Horning Ferry, Ranor Hall, as he calls it, and picks up an oak tree, carts it back to St Martin at Oak, and puts it in the churchyard to replace the original oak, which is long since gone, 100 years and more. This is 1656. Now, you might think if he's doing it 10 years later, it might be in some way connected with the Restoration, because oaks become very popular under Charles II. He hides in one at Boscobel, and indeed you get all sorts of little things showing oak trees and acorns. But it's in the Commonwealth. Now, the Commonwealth don't want things like that. They chop down maypoles, for heaven's sake, and ban Christmas. So it's an odd thing to be doing in 1656 at the height of the rather unloved and joyless Commonwealth. But he does do it anyway, and the important thing is he's brought this young oak from Ranor Hall, from Horning Ferry, to St Martin's at Oak, and replanted it. And that must be the oak tree referred to on the 1667 token, and indeed Bloomfield, writing in the mid-18th century, says that the oak tree there is only about 100 years old. which of course fits perfectly. So that's the original oak tree replaced. Sadly, that oak tree has gone, because St Martin at Oak, I'm afraid, is yet another one. This is replaced in the 30s. This is replaced in 1942. Tower gone. And this is replaced today. You can see it's got this truncated, stunted tower. And then now the Wharf Academy of Music. And it has 2 oak trees in the front, none around the back. But again, these aren't that old. I'm not a tree surgeon, but even I know they're not 300 years old. Okay, returning to Taybor, we will leave him at St Martin's Gate, because there's one last bit on that map of kings which I want to show you. We have here the church. This is the map of 1728, Hoyles. This is King's, and King's map names Tabor's Folly. This is the northwest corner of Gildencroft, which is an area used for recreation. You've got the Justing Acre, the former jousting grounds, and then the Folly grounds. And this is where people meet and congregate and have fun. And indeed, you quite often get in the mail to court books the city's father saying, tell them to stop doing this, they're muddying the grass, that sort of thing. But we know that Taybor has this property. Some people have said that Taybor refers to little tambourines, little drums. It's not, it's an actual property. It's a pub called Tabor's Folly. We know it was owned by Taybor, and then it's left to his son, who owns it for a few years and sells it in the mid-1670s. Taybor dies in 1670. So, no longer survives. This is all heavily built over now, as you might imagine. It's no longer the green space it once was. But rather nice, that. And we have finally one other reference to Taybor. He might have been a constable and a churchwarden, but he's not above being a bit naughty himself. This is summoning him to court, John Taybor, blah, blah, for abusing of John Sarson, one of the constables of Coslany Ward, and refusing to watch. So, presumably, Sarson has tried to get John Taybor to do some watch, probably presuming to be a member of the watch, refusing to watch. He's told Sarson where to get off, probably because he was a constable himself before, and he's not going to do it. And so he's summoned to answer for his naughtiness. But anyway, I think we're about done now, so we have reached the gate of St Martin's, and I think we'll leave it there. Thank you.
Now, me in my capacity, it takes me to give on your behalf a vote of thanks to Dr. Adrian Marsden. In order to give a vote of thanks, I have to write things down, because as somebody once described, I have the attention span of a gnat. I can't remember things very long. However, I don't know if you can see, but today's talk was done without the aid of any notes. And I just think it's absolutely amazing that Adrian is able to do this for us this morning. And I apologise for anybody watching online, because that will probably make a nasty noise. But there was no notes. And it's a bit of a wet day outside in Norwich. But we've been on a journey today around the city, looking at all these various different historical points that are still in our city. It was really good to find out about poor old Bridget, though dead yet dear, etc., etc., with her 22 children, followed by his second wife with 10 children. We've been all over the city, and yet we've not moved from our spot here at St Peter Mancroft. We've heard about cutlers and challow chandlers, and also gardeners. We've learned most recently about the oak in Oak Street. But I don't know about you. I think we've had a very, very interesting talk this morning. Do have a look at one of the graves for one of the people who issued tokens in the past, which is down where our welcomers are at the back of the church. And also do take the opportunity to look at the exhibition either today or in the coming days. And of course, also take the opportunity to get one of those really interesting books which Adrian has produced. So on your behalf, may I say thank you so very much, Adrian, for what you have imparted today. And like the weather, I'm sure you've whetted our appetite for some more. So thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming. Now, of course, tomorrow is Wednesday, and tomorrow's talk at 11:30 is by Jan King, who's one of the guides in the city. She's going to take us on a guided tour around Norwich again while we sit in our pew, and she'll be talking about the history of Mancroft and its relevance to the city, and also, of course, to our wonderful marketplace next door. So if you're around tomorrow, join us either in person or online. Thank you.